So hello everyone. The first video, if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend just to check it out. It was kind of just an overview of what we're going to be covering in this series, focusing on the Sicilian Najdorf. And I talked about the different options available on White's sixth move. I may have forgotten one or two, but we'll get around to them later on in the series. One of the first options that I mentioned is one of the big lines against the Najdorf is generally referred to as the classical line, a little bit more positional than other options available to White, but certainly also can be quite dynamic and aggressive depending on how the game flows. So let me just put that position on the board. It's e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight to c3, a6, and this is, the position that we are kind of going to use as a starting off point, as a jumping off point for an analysis of the different variations available to White and what Black can do about them. Today we are going to be covering the move bishop, not bishop to g5, but rather the move bishop to e2. And this is I think it's also called the Opaczynski variation or something like this, but most people just refer to it as the classical variation, so that is the name that I am going to use to refer to this move. Now here Black actually has a couple of different moves available to him, two moves that are overwhelmingly popular as a response to this move, and they are either the pawn push to e5 or the pawn push to e6. The thing about the move e6 is that objectively it's just as good as e5, but it changes the character of the position and it takes us into more of a Sicilian Scheveningen than a Sicilian Najdorf. So I won't be examining this move. Instead we'll be reacting in this sort of Najdorf, in the spirit of the Najdorf, and so my recommendation is the move e5. Now already Black is putting this white knight to it's making White answer a question, and so the white knight has seemingly three squares available to it. However, it should be noted that knight to f5 is not a good idea. Why is this so? Well, after the move knight f5, Black has the tactical shot d5 available. Now White cannot capture on d5 because the pawn on e4 is protecting the knight on f5. Now in general in the Sicilian, in these kind of situations, it's, after White's main move, let's say knight to b3, well, Black is going to have a hard time pushing the pawn from d6 to d5. And as we can see, this pawn stands a risk of becoming a bit of a backwards pawn, right? I mean, right now it's not like it's completely hemmed in. If there was a pawn on, say, the c2 pawn, if it was on c4, then this would be, truly a backwards pawn. But nonetheless, it can be a liability, and Black in general wants to try and impose himself in the center and play the move d5, and White will want to avoid allowing that. So with the move knight f5, the problem is that Black achieves his goal by tactical means. Once the pawn is gone, then this bishop gets opened up, and also more pressure lands on the white center. Now, here in this particular position, White's only real, I think, logical continuation is to move bishop to g5. Now the problem is that d takes e4 no longer appeals because of a very nice tactical sequence. After d takes e4, White actually captures on d8, king takes d8, and now castles with check. The king can step away, takes on f6. Now Black is not in time to capture the knight on f5, since rook d8 would be checkmate. So g takes f6 is forced. And here, of course, white is down a pawn. He cannot capture because of the attack on his knight. But after a simple move like bishop to g4, we look at the position and we see that black may have the bishop pair, but that doesn't really count for much in this position because white's knight is extremely strong. It's certainly not worse than these bishops. White has many threats, some knight d6 ideas in certain situations, and certainly recapturing the pawn on e4. But also there are, well, I should say, once the knight has recaptured the pawn and material is equal once again, well, knights on f5 and e4 are going to really cause some serious trouble here and also here on f6. In addition to this, black's king has already moved a couple of times, and he has no development. So we can say, just from a quick glance at this position, we can say that black is in a lot of trouble. So he has to be careful not to capture on e4. That would be a big mistake. But instead to play the move d4. So now see that the pawn started on d6. It's now in d4, and it's gone from being a little bit of a backwards pawn to being actually a very strong supported pawn that is immediately, asking a question of this knight on c3. The good news for white is that he can continue with the move bishop takes f6, and here black doesn't really want to capture back with the g-pawn, as his pawn structure would not be very good, and then this knight would be very difficult to challenge since the e-pawn is already here on e5, and there would be no g-pawn, so this knight would become very strong. So black recaptures with the queen, and now white has the move knight to d5, and black steps back onto d8. Now here white needs to deal with the threat bishop takes f5, because of course after e takes f5 then the knight on d5 is falling. So the move bishop to c4 comes to mind and certainly places itself on a good diagonal. Now here in this particular position, I think that black is doing very well. He's won the bishop pair, and specifically this bishop is very strong. And while the two white knights may look very strong, because they're on a white square, you notice that if a knight is on a white square, of course this is rather obvious, but we'll just represent it like this visually. When the knight is on a white square, as you can see, it can only jump to a dark square. And so both knights are on these light squares, meaning that they're kind of pointing, sure, they're pointing at some key central squares, and maybe, can try and attack the black king to an extent. But on the other hand, black, with his pawn structure on dark squares and his dark squared bishop with no dark squared counterpart for white, it means that black can, and even his queen on a dark square, it means that black can organize a very strong defense along the dark squares in general. So black need only to develop with a move like knight to c6, and eventually can start kicking back white's pieces. The knight on a5 can potentially attack the bishop and kick it back. This knight on f5 can certainly be kicked back with a move like g6 very soon. And even the knight on d5 might feel uncomfortable after a move like bishop to e6. So black's position can be said to be very good. He only needs to consolidate, and he will almost certainly have the better chances in the game. I should draw your attention to one very sneaky little trap that actually strong players have fallen for this move, for this little sneaky little idea, especially because it's very rare that a grandmaster faces knight f5, so they may not be familiar with this, or they may forget. I will show it right now. The sneaky move, the sneaky trap, arises if black plays g6. This is actually a bit of a blunder. You can pause if you wish, pause and try to figure out what white's strong reply is to this premature g6 move. So knight takes d4. This is the clever little idea. Now, if black recaptures the sacrificed knight, then white can play the move queen takes d4, striking at the rook on h8. And unfortunately for black, he doesn't have a defense for this rook. Sure, he can move the rook away to g8, but after the move knight f6 check, then as you can see, the black queen cannot capture on f6 because of the attack, because it is defended by the queen on d4. And at the very, very least, black will be losing a rook, and so that will be enough to win the game for white. Actually, you know, this is crazy, because this particular trap, a very, very strong player from Russia, Alexander Grischuk, for many, many years he was in the top 10 in the world. Even, I think he climbed as high as the second or third highest rated player in the world. Very strong player indeed, and very, very tactically sharp player. But admittedly in a Blitz tournament, in the Moscow Blitz in 2014, he fell for this idea against the young grandmaster Daniil Dubov. So make sure that you play a move like knight c6, for example. This defends on d4, so now there are no knight takes d4 ideas. And eventually then you can kick out the knight on f5, which is certainly annoying black. So let's go back a few moves and let's get back to this position here, bishop e2. This is the classical line that we're looking at. Now after e5, we were saying that the knight doesn't have so many squares available. f5 is not a good idea because, among other options, the move d5 is pretty strong for black, gets him a nice position. So the a6 square obviously is covered, so really this leaves only two options. By far the most popular move is knight to b3, but let's very, very quickly look at this idea of knight f3 instead. Now bear in mind that in this line, white typically brings the knight over to the queen side. He will castle short, and then he will push this f-pawn. However, once the knight goes on to f3, the possibilities of pushing the f-pawn are much more limited, and so in general this is considered a less aggressive line and a little bit more of a positional line. One of the ideas behind this move is that white isn't going to focus on some sort of central pressure or even some kind of kingside attack, but instead is going to be focusing more on positional play. We said earlier that one of the reasons why knight f5 is not such a good idea is because black gets this possibility of playing the move d5 early on. Whereas here in this kind of structure, black's pawn on d6 remains a backward pawn. So white is going to try to play against this. In some lines, white maybe brings the queen to d3 and the rook over to d1, and will try and pressure this point. And if black isn't careful, you know, he will potentially even snatch that pawn. But that is very difficult for white to do if black plays well. He has many, many resources at his disposal. So after the move knight to f3, black can actually play the move h6. This is one option, and it's definitely a nice idea because the point is that you block the bishop from ever going to g5, and the idea behind this is that when this knight here is covering the d5 square, right? So if white wants to kind of play around this square and really make any d5 ideas impossible in the future, or use the d5 square as an outpost for a knight, then exchanging, you know, removing this knight is beneficial for white. So that's why black can play a kind of a prophylactic move, h6, and avoid these ideas. But I'm going to recommend just a simple bishop to e7 because I really don't think that this is such a big deal. Let's, for example, look at this move now. Black can play the move knight bd7, and now he's preparing to recapture with the knight so that there's still going to be some control over the d5 square if white does indeed give up his bishop, which is generally not going to be a good idea for white because this dark squared bishop is quite strong. Notice that, for example, this diagonal is a little bit vulnerable. The pawn is, after all, here rather than, say, on e3. So if black's bishop can either, if white swaps off and black takes back, say with the knight, then in the long run, this bishop can maybe establish itself on this diagonal or on this diagonal. And in either case, this is going to be a strong bishop, and coupled with the fact that it'll be a part of the bishop pair, black is going to have a lot of compensation. Even if white does have, good control over the d5 square, black will have a good game. So after knight bd7, let's say that white goes ahead and castles. This is the main move, and black simply castles. Black's play is pretty straightforward so far, and now white needs to continue his development, so he might choose a move like queen d2. This is the main option here, and black has more or less developed all his pieces. His bishop still on c8 needs to find a purpose. So he plays the move b5 here. And this move b5 is very nice because it's very, very typical. And if you play the Najdorf, you'll have to get used to pushing the b pawn in many, many games. And it serves a couple of purposes. Black here in the Najdorf, I mean, he has this 2 pawns versus 1 in the center. But as we've said, he does have this backward pawn. So in general, a huge achievement for black is if he can play the move d5 under good circumstances, under favorable circumstances. Right now, obviously, white would just capture the pawn, and that would be goodbye to an important pawn for black. But with the move b5, black actually uses, this is a very common theme in the Najdorf, he expands on the queen side, but not in this case to attack, like in other variations where the king is actually on c1, let's say, if white had castled queenside. But instead, in this case, he does this move with a couple of purposes. One is to play b4 at a good moment, and then that will kick the knight out, and then you could potentially grab the pawn on e4. And then perhaps the main reason for this move is that he wants to bring his bishop to b7. White could continue with a move like a3 here to prevent this b4 idea, and black now would continue with the move bishop to b7. And notice how this setup, you should become familiar with it, because this is a pretty common way to set up your pieces in a few of the variations of the Najdorf. And all of the black pieces are working quite well here. The bishop is pressing down on the e4 pawn. The knight is also pressing on the e4 pawn. So already white needs to address this. And so he does with the move bishop to d3. But now black has the move knight to c5, putting further pressure on e4. Here white would have to continue to defend this pawn. Either he could, potentially take on f6 so that there's one less attacker on the pawn, or otherwise play a move like rook to e1. But still, black has completed his development. He has some moves coming up in the future, things like this, maybe put a rook on d8. He can still work towards trying to get this d5 move going sooner rather than later. And in general, his position is quite comfortable. So let's go back and let's see. Okay, so castle, queen d2. Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to say is knight f3, bishop e7. I said, okay, this bishop g5 idea, we don't need to worry about it too much by playing h6. We can just allow white to play this move. There is no disaster. I wanted to point out that if white castles here instead of playing bishop to g5, black can just go ahead and castle, and after bishop to g5, well, we get a transposition, which means different move order, but ultimately the same position. So we don't need to look at this line any further, because we can just get to the same, we can draw the same conclusions. So yeah, as you can see, knight f3, of course, I should add whenever I can, I should always try to remind you guys that this is not by any means an exhaustive analysis of the knight f3 line of the Najdorf. We simply don't have time to look at it in the depth that, say, grandmasters would look at it, but this should be enough to give you a bit of an idea. So okay, so we've seen that knight f5 would be a bit of a mistake. We've seen that knight f3 is not a very challenging move. Black can just continue his development, bishop e7, castle short, bring his knight out to d7, push the pawn on b5, bring the bishop to b7, create some pressure here on the e-pawn, on the central pawn, and if circumstances allow, push d5 sooner or later. At a club level, many opponents of yours will actually simply allow you to release your slightly vulnerable d-pawn, backwards d-pawn, very quickly, and you'll get a great position. Not so easy, of course, against stronger, 2000 or 2100 plus players. So yeah, now we go on to the main line, which is this move, knight to b3, and here, Black continues his development, and the move that I recommend is bishop to e7. You can also bring the bishop to e6, but what I don't really like about this move is that it gives White this added option of f4. So now if White plays f4 and Black, let's say, were to continue with the move bishop to e7, well, White could potentially push the pawn on f5 and immediately challenge this bishop. So why not simply forget about all of these possibilities, play the bishop to e7, and it's also, I think, a bishop that should be developed before the queenside bishop, since Black wants to bring his king to safety as soon as possible. So White will generally castle here, Black will castle, and White will continue his development and bring the bishop to e3. Here in this situation with the knight on b3, White isn't really playing for dominance of this d5 square, so the move bishop to g5 doesn't make too much sense. And also, in certain situations, not here, but in certain situations, if White brings the bishop out onto a square like g5, there can be some tactical shots like knight takes e4, and now bishop takes e7, knight takes c3, in between move, bishop takes here, and knight takes d1. Personally, I don't really like it for Black in this kind of a position, because, okay, White can always play a move like bishop here, and escape with his bishop, grab the pawn on d6, and the question is your knight going to escape from White's clutches? So I certainly don't recommend this move here, but it's just a nice little tactical idea to keep in mind, because in other positions it may very well work for Black. Either way, this isn't in White's plans, so instead he plays the move bishop to e3. I actually, before we go into the move bishop to e3, I want to look at not the most popular option. This bishop to e3 is the most popular option, but I want to look at the move king to h1. Now, against this move, Black has many very different continuations. He can play b5, he can play b6, he can play bishop to e6, he can even play knight to c6. They're all very natural moves, and this is one of the things about the Najdorf. It's a very complex, nuanced kind of opening, and quite flexible as well. So it's, I think, on the one hand, you do have to remember a lot of things, but on the other, you also need to understand very well the different plans and schemes in order to play it well, because otherwise, if you're just basing yourself on rote memory alone, there are so many lines to look at that would be too difficult. So after the move king to h1, my recommended choice is simply to bring the knight out to c6. I think the knight here does a very good job in its natural square. White now can play the move f4. This isn't the only move available to White, but it's certainly the main move. So let's look. Now after f4, black can choose the move b5. And here, white has a few options available to him. Bishop e3 is a move that has actually been played more than once by Magnus Carlsen. So it's a move that should be taken seriously. But again, let's show how black would continue his play, continue his development. Brings his bishop onto this diagonal, x-raying the e4 pawn. And especially when you can combine it with the fact that the pawn here on b5 can always kick the knight out from c3. Certainly this is something that white needs to watch out for. White actually typically will play this move, a4. And this is very thematic where, you know, I should have perhaps said that when black plays this move of b5, he creates a target, right? I mean, and this is very, very common way of trying to undermine that target and put a little bit of pressure on black's queen side. But here, black can respond with e takes f4. Again, very, very typical in these positions. At some point, black releases the tension here. White could, in some situations, press f5. That's usually not such a big concern for black. But one of the nice things about capturing on f4 from black's perspective is that the e5 square is now available, and that's a very nice square for him to place a knight at some point in the future. Now, white typically recaptures with the rook, which may seem a little bit of an odd move. Most people would think bishop takes f4 is the right way to go. But the problem with bishop takes f4 is that after b4, knight to d5, and the simple move knight to e5, ignoring the e pawn for now, well, as you can see, black is placing a lot of pressure on white's center. And on the other hand, black is quite well placed, right? This knight, as I say, is influencing the center. This knight looks very good in this square. And sure, black has this somewhat vulnerable pawn and somewhat vulnerable b pawn. But on the other hand, white's pawn on e4 is a bit of a liability as well. And this pawn, it's going to be kind of difficult for white to grab that pawn anytime soon because he needs to take care of the center. So the position is quite nice for black if white plays in this fashion. Instead, white normally captures with the rook. And after rook takes f4, black brings his knight to e5. For now, ignoring the fact that this pawn can be captured. We'll see why that doesn't really worry black. After we look at this possibility, sometimes white plays the move queen to d4. One of the points of the move queen to d4 is that black is actually threatening the move b4. Again, a very, very annoying typical problem for this knight on c3. So with queen d4, black stops this, or white stops this rather, but black can actually just step back with the knight and hit the queen. Now the queen goes back to d2, and black simply steps back in with the knight on e5. Now sure, we see that the queen was on d1, then went to d4, knight c6, then back to d2, and now knight to e5. So we can say that the white queen has actually gained the tempo with this whole maneuvering. It's still white's move. It begun as white's move, and now it's still white's move. And the difference is that white's queen was on d1 before, and now it's on d2. Sure, it looks a little bit better on d2, but it turns out that's not really such a big deal for black, and he can afford to do that just so that he can renew his threats at b4 and things like that. Now, as a result of this, notice also I should point out that this rook on f4 is playing a defensive role against e4. But notice how knight to g6 would hit the rook, force it to move away, and then the pawn on e4 would collapse. And actually, this is, you know, one of the appeals of the Najdorf, and why I think it's a good choice at club level, if that is where you're at right now, or some kind of similar rating. Because the thing is, at that level, white generally isn't so aware, like theoretically aware or strategically, tactically aware. And in this case, you know, I've played the Najdorf many times over the years, and I can tell you from experience that very, very often black gets in that d5, quick d5 break, maybe wins a pawn on the center. Some other ideas that we'll see sometimes brings a rook to c8 and offer, you know, gets in a kind of a crushing exchange sacrifice. There are many different possibilities in the opening for white if he doesn't play well, because here we're looking at a game played by Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. So, you know, most players are not going to put up that kind of a resistance. So e takes f4, and getting back to the game, we've had this dancing around, knight back, jumping back and forth, and the queen moving. Now the queen is on d2, but white knows if I go back to d4, knight c6, black is going to get a draw, which Carlsen would like to avoid. So he goes ahead and he snaps off the pawn on b5, and this is what we said earlier, that black is offering this pawn. A takes b5, and now the problem is that if white were to capture here on a8, then black could take on a8, and we see that sure, the pawn on b5 can be picked up by either the bishop or the knight, but black has the knight, bishop and queen all pointing at the e4 pawn, and so black is more than happy to trade this b pawn for this strong central pawn. And we can see also that black's pieces are working very well together here, whereas white is maybe lacking a little bit of coordination. So we can say that black is at the very, very least equal in this the variation. Carlsen actually played the move rook to e1, but after knight to g6, what we mentioned earlier, the rook got hit, rook ff1, and now we see the power of this b pawn. b4 gets played here, and after knight d5, Carlsen's opponent, a very strong Russian grandmaster in the 2700 rating region, just simply grabbed the pawn on e4. And okay, maybe Carlsen had a little bit of compensation, but certainly not enough. He cannot grab on b4 with the queen, because then bishop takes knight would win a piece. So Carlsen just had to play on a pawn down with a little bit of compensation. But in the end, Carlsen did actually lose that game. So this is, we're going to go back now. And yeah, these are ideas stemming from the move king to h1, right? We said earlier bishop to e3 instead of king to h1. But yeah, let's continue to look at this king h1 idea. The knight, as we said, we recommended going to c6, f4, b5, and now what we've been looking at is this move bishop to e3, after which bishop to b7, and then if a4, then e takes f4, and we saw this game Carlsen Nepomniachtchi, I think, played in 2011. After b5, white doesn't have to play bishop to e3. He could play a move like a4, but again we see a typical idea very similar to what we looked at in this line, which is black actually, he could push to b4, but he can also, in some situations like here, ignore the attack on the pawn and simply develop his bishop. White can capture the pawn. Now he has to deal with this. Rook takes a8, queen takes a8, and now white goes ahead and snaps off the pawn. But the problem is, we see again, we're beginning to see a pattern in terms of, in the Najdorf, a lot of the time we are putting pressure on this pawn on e4. That's why we want the bishop here. That's why this knight plays a very important role, and that's why sometimes this knight we even bring from d7 to c5 to put pressure. That's also why we push the b pawn, so that we can influence this knight and maybe kick it off at a right moment, at a good moment. And here it's also why black could afford to sacrifice a pawn, because in exchange he brings his queen to a8, gains a little bit of time. And now the problem is that black, after white captures the pawn, black plays the move knight to a7, and the idea is he's hitting the bishop on b5, but he's also hitting the pawn 3 times, and white only has one defender. so there's no way that he can stop black from winning this pawn. And as in general, black is going to be happy to lose his b pawn in exchange for white's e pawn. So and also it should be said that when black wins white's e pawn, as is the case here, then the pawn on d6 is no longer such a problem, because it's no longer a backwards pawn. It can now advance up the board much more easily, and it can actually become a very, very powerful pawn. Let's step back a few moves. So after f4, we've seen this idea b5, and we've seen Carlsen's move bishop to e3, and we've seen a4. In both lines, sooner or later, black has sacrificed the pawn here in exchange for a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. Certainly not necessary. Another idea that can be played here is the move bishop to f3. It seems very, very natural, but notice that the bishop has now abandoned this square, and so black actually has this nice thematic idea, which is to bring the knight to a5. And here now the knight is already eyeing up a very important square, c4. So white, usually this knight is not really doing much anyway, so white is happy enough to trade off here and prevent knight c4. Black can grab the knight, and now white opens up the f file, f takes, d takes e5. But the thing about it is, if we take stock here and we look at the position, black has swapped off a couple of knights, probably favors black, since sometimes in these variations he can have a little bit less space. Sure, white has this semi-open f file, which he can maybe exploit, but realistically this shouldn't be a big deal. Black is pretty safe, has plenty of pieces around his king and a good pawn structure, so it's unlikely that he's going to get attacked down this file. And the bishop for now is pointing at, you know, its own pawn, so it's not overly active. Black's pawn structure is objectively better because this is an isolated pawn, and so we can say that with a move like bishop e6 or bishop b7 coming in soon, and then bringing the rooks over to one of these three squares, e8, b8 or c8 depending, we can say that the black position is quite good here. So these are all the main ideas within this f4 move, which is actually the f4 move after this relatively trendy king h1 idea. So let's instead look at the move bishop to e3. This is the main way of playing the game for white. Black can respond with bishop to e6, and notice that already black is threatening this possibility d5 if white kind of sits around idly and does nothing, like maybe plays a move like h3 or a move like a3. White here will typically play queen to d2, but this is the main line actually, queen to d2, but f4 is also worth taking a look at. Now after f4, e takes f4 is played, and here white can capture back with either the bishop or with the rook. With the bishop, it's the most popular way of capturing in this case, because after rook takes f4, black simply continues to develop. One of the important things to notice is the pawn structure has changed a little bit, but black is pretty happy with this because white now has this isolated pawn on e4, and d5 will sooner or later occur, and the absence of this pawn means that the knight can jump onto e5, which is a very, very good square for the knight. White actually uses his outpost, knight to d5, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and now the move knight to e5. White plays c4, solidifying on d5, and the structure has now changed in white's favor. But now black can play now that this knight, it's hitting on d5, but of course d5 is very well defended, not really doing anything else beyond that. So black actually plays the move knight to d7, protecting against some possible c5 ideas. Also, more than anything though, beginning to work along the dark squares, right? We see that this knight can maybe in the future jump into c5, maybe into b6, certainly supporting the knight on e5, and also this bishop on e7. This diagonal has now been opened up, and so black is preparing to play a move like bishop to g5. Certainly exchanging these bishops would be good for black. And this is just, you know, I would say a dynamically balanced position. It can go either way, really, but I think that the position is quite pleasant for black. One of the things is that the f-file is not really such a big deal for white to possess, because here the f-pawn is very, very solid and it's even being defended by the knight. Whereas this e-file, well, black can at some point play the move rook to e8, and the two bishops here are going to be getting x-rayed. And also, as I say, bishop to g5 is a bit of a threat, because this bishop here is an important part of white's position, especially since it's guarding this diagonal. And this diagonal with the king on g1 can be something that needs to be watched out for. Otherwise, moves like queen b6 check may be problematic. So definitely a lot of play here, and an interesting position. But let's go back. So here, instead, white will usually capture with the bishop, knight to c6, and now we'll play a move like king h1, again stepping away from this diagonal because of the queen, rook c8, queen to e1, getting onto this diagonal and also freeing up the d1 square to put pressure on on d6, and also make it unattractive for black to play the move d5. And here black can actually continue in a number of ways. But, you know, one simple one is to simply put the knight on e5, and after rook to d1, bring the queen on c7. So, sure, white has this square, which he can use at some point to jump into. But on the other hand, black will argue, well, I have a very, very nice square for my knight. All my pieces are reasonably well placed. And even after white brings his knight into play again, black can simply respond with a move like rook e8, putting a bit of pressure down the e-file. This pawn is something that white has to be careful about, and also black will at some point be able to expand on the queen side and put pressure on both c2, and because if this expansion happens, it'll hit the knight, well, that will also put pressure on e4, and always white will have to watch out for a potential d5 break in the air. So overall, once again, I would say this position is roughly equality. It's dynamically balanced. Many things that can happen, and this is what the Najdorf will give you. It'll give you complex positions where most of the time the winner is simply going to be the player who played better on the day. So this all arose from move here, this particular position. We were saying that after bishop e6, in this position, we said bishop e3 instead of this king h1 idea. Now black plays to move bishop to e6, and we said, well, white has this idea of f4 immediately, in which case black can simply recapture. Another idea that white has in this position is to simply jump the knight onto d5. If this happens, well, black can simply ignore it, knight beat to d7. Covering this b6 square is important, because otherwise, well, either bishop to b6 or knight b6 could land black in trouble with this rook. So knight bd7, completing the development. White could grab the bishop pair here, but it's certainly not a big deal, because, you know, in this position, if the bishop goes, right now the bishop is not so good because it's being hemmed in by its own pawns. And if the bishop goes, well, the queen will recapture, then rooks will come into play, and then d5 will happen sooner or later. So so black will get a lot of pluses going for him in exchange for white having the bishop pair. I should also say that after knight d5, there's a possibility of simply grabbing the pawn on e4, and I mentioned that bishop to d6 can give problems to this rook on a8. But the thing about it is, black could play queen d7, knight c7, except that the rook is not going to be able to be saved. Play the move knight to c6, and after white grabs the rook on a8, we have this position. And actually, this is a very, very interesting, dynamically more or less balanced position. On the one hand, white has won an exchange, but hey, on the other, black has won an important central pawn, the pawn on e4, and now has these two pawns, which can sooner or later really have a strong effect. And for now, with a lot of minor pieces on the board, having lost the rook is not such a huge deal. For now, there aren't so many open files, etc., etc. So this game, this is definitely possible, but personally, I don't recommend it because, well, you know, the way I see it is that even though black may not be worse, I don't think that black is better either. So you can just play the move knight bd7, and it's solid, and it, you know, doesn't get you into this kind of territory where you've given up in exchange for only a pawn. Having said that, if that's the kind of player that you are, if that feeds into your style, I thought I'd mention it because it's definitely an option. So after knight bd7, typically white will play a move like queen to d3, and here now you can actually just snatch this knight. This is quite common. Bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and here Boris Gelfand, the Israeli #1, he and challenger of Vishy Anand for the World Championship not so long back, he has played the move knight to c5, again changing the structure of the position after knight takes c5, d takes c5, and sure, after the move c4, white does have this passed pawn, but black can respond with a move like e4 here, say queen to d2, and now bishop to d6. So this is a protected passed pawn. Can be a little bit of a problem for black if he's not careful. But on the other hand, black has 3 and 4 here on the king side against only 3. And this pawn could potentially advance as well once the knight maybe redirects itself to a different square. For now, the bishop here is doing a good job of blocking the d pawn. It's a very, very difficult pawn to advance, and it's also eyeing up the h2 square. So there are some attacking possibilities in connection with the pawn majority on the king side for black. So this is a dynamic position, and once again, my valuation is the same as before. As in other lines, this is simply you know, a game with a lot of life in it that could go either way. So yeah, this is a typical reaction against this idea of the knight jump to d5. So instead of all of that, let's just look at the main move, queen to d2. Now, we had said that if white is not careful, black can actually play the move d5 and free himself. But here's a good situation in which black has to be a little bit careful of the d5 advance. So what's the problem with the move d5 here? Well, after d5, white can actually simply swap everything off. Right? And the problem is that white is actually two things in this position. The first is he has already completed his development, whereas you see black's knight is still on b8. And then in addition, white has this queenside majority against this particular structure. And here, especially with the pawn having already gone to a6, well, it slightly weakens the black queenside. Notice how this bishop is controlling an important square like b6. And so the problem is that when white plays moves like knight c5 or knight a5 and hits the b7 pawn, it can actually be quite difficult for black to finish his development in a good way. Let's say, for example, white plays the move rook fd1, and black were to retreat the bishop back to a square like c6. Already after a move like knight a5, black would be in a bit of trouble here. He cannot play b6 because the bishop is eyeing up this square, and he cannot develop his knight because knight takes bishop followed by rook takes knight would end things in white's favor. And also, as we see, this weakening means that white may even be able to remaneuver knight to c4 and knight to b6 in the future in certain situations. And the pawn again on e5 is also, after a move like knight c4, it's looking a little bit shaky. Whereas white's bishop's here influencing the queen side, and even this bishop can potentially land on this diagonal in the future, gives white very, very easy play. And the pawn side majority is the last thing to mention. Well, this does mean that white has the opportunity of perhaps creating a passed pawn on the queen side, which could be very, very dangerous coupled with all the other advantages that he has. And on the other hand, black's kingside majority here is not really so threatening. It's more threatening maybe with the queens on in a position such as this, where black has yet to push d5 and create these massive trade-offs. So d5 in this particular case, and in some cases, I just wanted to draw your attention to it, it's not always a good idea in the Najdorf, but yeah, it's something that you should always keep in mind, whether or not you can play d5, but then you have to be careful about this particular theme that I just illustrated, which is black isn't quite fully developed and his queen side is a little bit vulnerable. So black plays the move knight bd7 instead, and here white plays a4. And the final deviation from, let's say, this as the main line that I want to look at is here I would recommend, well, you can just play a move like rook to c8, bring the rook onto this semi-open c-file, and it's a nice position. But if instead of that you want to play a little bit differently, Carlsen played in Nanjing in the Chinese tournament back in 2009, where Carlsen famously had a more than 3,000 rating performance, which is simply insane. He played the move knight to b6, and after a5, the idea is that after this move a5, well, this is black's plan, knight to c4, hitting both the bishop and the queen. White has to part with one of his bishops. He chooses to part with the bishop on e2, the light squared bishop on e2. And after bishop takes c4, rook fd1, rook c8, this knight isn't doing a great job. Notice that's one of the key points of this setup in the Najdorf, that this knight on b3 is a little bit badly placed. But of course, we said earlier on in the video that the knight actually went from d4 to b3. It didn't want to go to f3 because at the time, even though we didn't see it in this particular variation, at the time white wanted to leave an option available to push the f pawn. So here white begins to regroup his knight to c1. The white player, a extremely strong Russian grandmaster, Dmitry Yakovenko, been in the top 50 for a long time now, and I think has climbed as high as about 2760. He was rated, I think, 2742 at the time, and more or less at the height of his powers. After the move queen c7, the game continued with rough equality. Black is probably going to bring his queen onto c6 to pressure the pawn on e4. That's another typical maneuver, and it's a nice square to be on when you have this knight on c3 that may jump to d5 and would be hitting you straight away, but from c6 you're pretty safe against it. And it also supports the d5 push and steps out of the way of some bishop b6 pins. If, for example, black were to play the move rook d8 too quickly, then the rook and the queen would be stuck there on this diagonal, and the black squared bishop on e3 could punish that. So that is pretty much the last variation that I wanted to look at, apart from just finishing off the main line. Here, after instead of knight to b6, my recommendation is simply rook c8. Now white can play a5, queen to c7, rook fd1, and now a move like rook fd8. Now, this is this is pretty nice here because this position, this kind of setup is something that black is going to be aiming for a lot of the time in the Sicilian Najdorf. Your bishop's on e7 and e6. One knight on f6 doing a good job here. The knight on d7 ready to be exchanged this way if black goes after it. Also, in some situations, as we saw Carlsen play this move, the knight b6 can jump to c4. Also, as we saw in a game by Gelfand earlier on, where black changes the nature of the pawn structure and plays knight to c5 instead. So the knight here definitely has many different possibilities. And also the fact that it's covering the b6 square does mean that bishop to b6 is not a threat. Otherwise, black would not be able to set himself up like this. So, yeah, and then of course the rooks are placed here on the d file and on the c file. Almost always you will be placing your queenside rook on c8. Your kingside rook sometimes goes to e8, other times to d8. That depends really on the way that the opening has panned out. So now that the rook is x-raying the queen steps away, queen to e1, and now black decides to take away the g5 square, but also has a nice little idea in mind. After the move rook to d2, black plays queen to c6. Again, you see the threat of capturing on e4. So white plays bishop to f3. He's having to defend. And now here is the nice little idea behind this move h6. Knight to h7. Now with this move, black may at some point exchange the bishops, the dark square bishops, although that's probably not too advisable here because, as we can see, white has been carrying out his own plans here, and he has made damn sure that black is not going to play d5 anytime soon, right? He's put his bishop here on f3, he has his pawn, he has his knight, he has his rook, and he may even bring another rook into play. And you can see this typical white plan to play against this backwards d6 pawn common in the Sicilian Najdorf, especially once you've played this move e5. However, after knight h7, white actually in the game stepped back onto d1, and now black played the move knight g5. The reason why white brought his queen back to d1 is because he saw that black's threat of knight g5 couldn't be prevented easily, and he wanted the possibility of bringing the bishop to g4 potentially supported, or leaving the bishop on f3, in which case if black decides to capture, he can always capture back with the queen. Nonetheless, we can say that this position is very comfortable for black. He only really has this one weakness, but he is protecting it very well. The bishop on e7 doing a great job of that, and you know, he has many different ideas. Maybe at some point he has a lot of pressure on e4, he can grab the bishop pair. He has pressure on the c file. It's hard for this knight to move. This knight on b3 is a little bit let's say poorly placed, so white needs to maneuver around. Black is also going to need to maneuver around and come up with a plan. But certainly we can say that this is again a very dynamic, rich position that can go either way. I'd love to sit here and, you know, talk about this line, this bishop e2 line, the classical variation of the Najdorf, for many more hours, but I think that already perhaps I've overwhelmed the viewer with information. Do let me know in the comments if this is a little bit too much and you want maybe something more simple, less lines suggested, and maybe a little bit more depth if this is hard to follow. But yeah, it's a difficult topic to really deal with, the Sicilian Najdorf. You know, you're always left with a choice between either trying to kind of provide a pretty thorough and comprehensive overview of the opening, but risking there being too much information, or alternatively making it a shorter, more summarized version, but then you're risking missing out on covering some key lines or some key ideas. So it's a tough balance to strike, but let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I may be in time to tweak my next episode accordingly. That's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, then please, as always, give my video a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, then please do subscribe. Other than that, I will be back for either episode 2 of this series, well, technically episode 3 after the introduction, and where I will be exploring another one of White's main options on move 6. Either that, or I will perhaps be back with a different kind of video and return to this at a later stage. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.